Those last few seconds before sleep takes you, that sweet release after a long day's work. This is where I was, lying in bed and ready to sleep. It was at times like these that I began staring outside my window. I live in a secluded area surrounded by a bunch of dense woodlands. It's a beautiful sight in the right circumstance. This isn't the right circumstance. As I drifted in and out of sleep, I was taking occasional glances out the window across from my bed. There it was, the large and twisted tree, which often took center stage at times like these. My vision was blurred by this point in the night, a consequence of drifting in and out of sleep, I guess. As I stared and began to close my eyes again, the tree seemed to have a bird in it, a very large bird. I sat up to get a better look at the tree, mildly intrigued to see a bird so large living so close to my house. The shape in the tree began to move more vigorously now, shaking and flailing about intensely. I started sitting up properly, moving my arms out of the blanket and into the cold of my room, posturing myself to get a better look. That's when it saw me. I couldn't immediately tell it saw me, but it did. The creature's movement stopped quickly, and the head turned towards me. It looked at me for a moment as I sat in bemusement of whatever the hell it was. The misconception of my sleep-deprived mind was obvious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, somehow broadcasting its feelings of hatred towards me. I thought to myself, that's a creepy fucking bird, which may very well have been the end of it. Things like this simply don't happen to normal people like me after all. As I was thinking this, I realized very quickly that it was not a bird. The creature's jaw unhinged, revealing a row after row of teeth, gleaming by the moonlight, all the while its head faced towards me in that foreboding stare. I blinked hard as I saw this, disbelieving at such a sight. The foggy state of my mind had dissipated now, entering the fight or flight response that the body does when faced with fear. Adrenaline rushed through me as I stared at the creature, as though if I stare hard enough, it will disappear. The beast's jaw remained open while all of these thoughts raced through my mind. As the staring match for the fate of my life continued, the creature began to move, first shutting its jaws and sinking back deep into the tree. Noticing this, I quickly leapt out of my bed to ring the local police, in hopes that they were perhaps missing an eldritch abomination. I made 4 steps before realizing the mistake. Whatever it was, it had moved closer. The rustling of branches was the first thing to have tipped me off. The second was the smell, a vile mix of sweet smell of decay and the putrid smell of rotting fruit. The rustling grew louder by the moment. What had been first far away now seemed tantalizingly close as the tree outside my own house joined the harmonic rustling. I moved slowly now. I figure if it could see me from so far away, it was likely that it would hear me now as well. I made my way to the spare bedroom I had in the house, the one which had a window facing into the yard. I didn't do this to get a view of the abomination up close, of course. This is where my salvation was, my only hope, the phone. I made my way through the small hall upstairs. It led only to the staircase and the spare room. I stepped slowly towards the door, feeling as if each step could give me away to my hunter. I began wincing after each step, as if being closed was amplifying my fear. Step by step past, the only sound being my hushed breathing and the howling wind blowing outside. I made it to the door after what felt like an eternity. I crouched to a sitting position to hide myself as best as possible. My hands were shaking now. Both the cold and the fear were taking their toll on my nerves. I grasped at the handle of the door, jostling it as I did so. I pulled down until it gave way. I pushed it in towards the room, ensuring to keep myself hidden as much as possible while I did so. The window was directly across from the door, and beyond that lay where the monster had made its home, the tree in my yard. I kept pushing the door, with each squeak of the hinges sending shivers down my spine. The smell was horrible now, so horrible I began to gag. I finally departed from the door and tried to approach the phone. It was located on the far right of the room, helpfully out of the way of the window. While doing this, I risked a glance upwards towards the window. This was my next mistake. The monster was looking at me now, and I was close enough to see the full extent of it. The arms were muscular and long. The body was enormous and black, matted with fur. The legs were long and winding. They bent backwards at the knees. The head was the feature which frightened me the most, its unhinged jaw facing me again. The head was large and snake-shaped, scaly and gleaming with slime, each row of teeth inside the mouth still shining. As it saw me, I froze. I felt like my joints had gone bone stiff, unable to move even in the slightest. It saw this effect and began to slowly slink down the tree, wrapping around it and descending like a snake. This was the cue my body needed to get moving again. I quickly ran to the window and threw the curtains across to close them. I ran to the door and shut it quickly behind me. It was only after shutting the door that I considered what the monster was doing. Why did it crawl down? Didn't it have me right where it wanted me? These questions were answered pretty quickly. The smell had been slowly leaking away with the monster's leave, but it suddenly came back in strides. Along with this came a shattering sound from downstairs. Whatever it was now inside my house. My heart sank. Any hope of a reprieve from this nightmare left my mind at that moment. It was now that I considered giving up hope entirely, giving in to my fate. But I persisted if only to end it on my own terms. I stood from my sunken position, moving towards the phone. I might as well see if the police can help. From downstairs I heard the thudding of the beast's footsteps as it meandered around my home. I picked up the phone as slowly as possible and rang the emergency number, hoping it wouldn't hear the ruckus. Then it came. Thud, thud, thud. It was making its way up the stairs. The slow and steady pace which moved scared me more than anything. It was like the monster was teasing me, instilling this fear inside of me out of malice, just as it had when it first looked at me. Again, I felt my nerves giving out, but I was steadfast in my attempts. The dial tone eventually turned to a slight screech as the emergency operator picked up the phone. "What's your emergency?" The operator's voice finally, I hope. "There's some kind of massive wild animal in my house." My voice came out in a frenzied croak as I tried to best explain my situation to elicit the best response. "Ma'am, this is an emergency hotline, not animal control," the operator said in a slow and disinterested voice, stripping away what was left of my hope. "It's going to kill me. Please send animal control or something which can take care of it," I pleaded to the operator, sounding like nothing more than a defeated cry. "I'll send animal control to your address if you can wait a few minutes." The operator gave in eventually, pitying me. I was gleeful with joy internally. A shred of hope returned to me. That was when it all came crashing down. The thudding had continued throughout my small conversation with the operator, and by now it had made its way upstairs. Now all that lay in its way was the hallway. The hallway faced directly toward the stairs. As I noticed this, the thudding halted. It was staring at me. I couldn't see it. The door was closed, so by all logic we shouldn't have been able to see each other at all. But it stared at me nonetheless. I could feel its malice. The thudding began again, inching closer by the second. I quickly hung up the phone in my best effort to obscure the noise from the monster, but it was too late. The monster was now directly outside of my door. Somehow its paralyzing gaze is unbroken through all of this. The smell was killing me now. A thick cloud of the creature's musk circled around the room and caused me to nearly vomit. I hurtled up against the wall opposite the door and placed myself directly below the window. It was my last shot. The creature continued to stare at me through the wall, looking at me and inflicting me with the same all-encompassing fear that it had almost all night. It began to tap against the door now, teasing me. Tap, tap, tap. Over and over, the tapping was slow and meticulous and slowly driving me insane. I sat still, the sweat beading on my forehead, now at a free fall as I sat there. I looked around for anything that might be of use if a fight should break out between me and it, but there was nothing to keep me from my inevitable fate. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping continued. It felt endless, like I would be there for the rest of eternity, accompanied only by the endless tapping at the door. By this point, I was almost ready to let whatever was beyond that door take me away. No fate could be worse than this. Enough time passed in this state that my fear began to turn to hatred, a strong hatred for whatever lay beyond that door, whatever had been staring at me, torturing me. Enough already, I shouted at the creature, and for a brief moment the tapping subsided, as it was taken aback by my defiance. After that brief interim, the tapping resumed, only louder now. Thud, thud, thud. It was like the creature switched from using a finger to an entire fist to slam the wooden door. The frame began to shake. It was clear that it couldn't take this much longer. I decided to take action now. I looked to the window behind me, the very same one in which I had seen the creature, the very same in which it saw me. I opened the window slowly and steadily in an attempt to mask my attempt from the creature. I unbuckled the latch and eased it open. I felt the creature's gaze lift slightly as I did so, and I prayed it wasn't onto me. I shimmied the window open the remainder of the way, the thudding of the door ever present as I did so. The cold air flew through the room, its freshness saving me from the foul smell which had plagued me for the last 20 minutes. I managed to move my body through the window, and outside the thudding of the door was getting louder as I did so. I got out and onto the rooftop in an attempt to evade it. I moved to the right of the window immediately as I did so, and felt the monster's gaze lift from me. This gave me the courage I needed to get out and away from there. I jumped from the second floor and landed hard onto the ground. My chest heaved as I forced myself to move upwards, my breathing becoming erratic and forced as I stood upright. As soon as I got to my feet, I began running, refusing to look back at my own home, only thinking of making it to the nearest public area. I pushed through the thickly wooded forest, never so much as thinking of looking behind to gauge the location of the creature. After 10 minutes of running, I exited the thick wood. Figuring I had escaped whatever had trapped me, I made my way to the local highway where I managed to hitchhike. As I got into the first car, I chanced a glance to the forest I had come out from, and there I saw the creature, perched atop a tree and staring. The familiar feeling of dread and malice washed over me again. This wasn't the end.